He said, "Our price is $4.8 million. Then nobody spoke. 1 second. 3. 5. At 6 seconds, he couldn't take it anymore. Obviously, there may be some flexibility depending on scope. Nobody had asked for a discount. Nobody had objected to the price. Nobody had even made a facial expression dramatic enough to qualify as news. He had simply experienced 6 seconds of silence and begun negotiating against himself. I've watched versions of this happen in rooms full of extremely accomplished people who can defend a strategy in front of a board, move hundreds of millions in capital, fire somebody before breakfast. But apparently, 6 seconds in which nobody speaks? Call emergency services, because externally, almost nothing is happening. The buyer looks at the CFO looks at the document, someone takes a sip of water. Internally, they hate the price. Sarah looked at David. Why did Sarah look at David? Was 4.8 too aggressive? I knew we should have said 4.6. Say something. And then comes one of the most expensive phrases in business. Just to add a little context, that sentence deserves its own risk disclosure, because what fascinates me isn't silence itself. It's what intelligent people do with silence when they don't know what it means. We hate an information vacuum, so we fill it, usually with ourselves. They're hesitating. They're offended. I've pushed too hard. They're losing interest. They think I'm difficult. The deal is slipping. Notice what's missing from every one of those statements. Evidence. Maybe Sarah looked at David because $4.8 million was over budget, or because it was under budget. Maybe she wanted his reaction. Maybe David had the spreadsheet. Maybe she was thinking about implementation. Maybe she was wondering why the coffee tasted like somebody had threatened a bean with hot water. We don't know. But uncertainty is uncomfortable, and discomfort has a remarkable ability to dress itself up as insight. I could tell they weren't comfortable. Could you? Or were you uncomfortable? That's a much more expensive question, because once we decide what another person's silence means, we often start responding to the story we've invented. The executive who quoted $4.8 million begins explaining the value again, then adds reassurance, then introduces flexibility, then perhaps offers a concession, and the other side still hasn't said anything. It's an extraordinary negotiation strategy when you think about it. Ask yourself for a discount and then approve it. But this doesn't only happen around price. I've seen it after someone says, "I disagree." Silence. Then, "Well, obviously, I completely understand the other perspective." Interesting. 4 seconds ago, you disagreed. Now you're conducting the appeal against your own decision. Or, "We can't commit to that timeline." Silence. Although perhaps if we moved some people around, nobody asked you to move anybody. Or, "That's the condition under which we'd proceed." Silence. Though there may be other structures we could explore. And there goes the condition. What interests me is that the person often believes they're being commercially sophisticated, flexible, collaborative, good at reading the room. Sometimes they are, but sometimes something much simpler has happened. They stated a position, and then discovered they couldn't tolerate occupying it without immediate reassurance. That's not really a negotiation problem yet, it's a behavioral one. Because silence removes the thing many high performers are extremely accustomed to receiving: feedback. Say something clever? Response. Present an idea? Questions. Make a recommendation? Discussion. State a price? Nothing. And suddenly the brain has no data. so it manufactures some. The irony is that the person who speaks next may give away exactly the information you were waiting for: a concern, a priority, a constraint, an objection, a competing offer. But if you rush to fill the gap first, you don't get to hear it. You replace their information with yours. And this is where I think the phrase, "use silence as power," gets the whole thing slightly wrong. Because sitting there, pretending to be some mysterious corporate sphinx, isn't particularly sophisticated either. Silence isn't powerful because it makes you look dominant, and counting to 10 in your head while staring aggressively at the procurement director is not tactical empathy. It's just unsettling. The interesting skill is something else. It's noticing the exact moment your brain converts "I don't yet know what they're thinking" into "I know what they're thinking, and it's bad." Because once that conversion happens, the next sentence out of your mouth may have almost nothing to do with the person across the table. It may simply be an attempt to make your own uncertainty disappear. And in a high-stakes room, that raises a rather uncomfortable question. How much of what we call reading the room is actually the room? And how much of it is us, panicking quietly inside it? Because if it's us, the problem gets more interesting. I started noticing when people break silence. Not just that they do, there's often a tiny sequence. You state the position, silence. You wait. Then your brain starts scanning the room for evidence. One person looks down, another crosses their arms, someone writes something. And suddenly, you're running a full behavioral analysis based on a man adjusting his cuff. I once watched someone come out of a meeting convinced the CEO hated his proposal. Why? He leaned back in his chair. That was it. Apparently, the future of the company had been revealed through lumbar support. This is what uncertainty does. It makes meaningless information feel meaningful. And in a high-stakes room, the temptation is to do something. Explain, clarify, reassure, offer, soften. Because action feels safer than waiting. But here's the strange part. The pause may be the first moment in the conversation when the other person is actually doing the work. Before that, you've been presenting, explaining, answering. Now you've put something in front of them that requires a decision. They may need to calculate, compare, think, work out what matters, perhaps even disagree with each other. And instead of allowing that process to happen, we interrupt it because their thinking is making us uncomfortable. Imagine asking someone, "Would you marry me?" And after 4 seconds saying, "Obviously, we could just continue dating. That's also a very strong option." You'd understand immediately what happened. Yet put everybody in expensive jackets around a walnut table, and somehow we call it commercial agility. And there is another reason the pause matters. It changes who is producing information. Think about that $4.8 million room. After the price was stated, the seller already knew his own position. What didn't he know? The buyers. So which person had the most valuable information left to reveal? Not him. Yet he kept speaking. That's the behavioral paradox. The person with the least new information to contribute can feel the greatest urgency to contribute it. And the more they talk, the more clues they may accidentally provide. Maybe flexibility exists. Maybe the deadline isn't firm. Maybe that condition isn't really a condition. Maybe the price has room. Maybe they're more anxious to close than they appeared 30 seconds ago. Silence didn't reveal weakness. The escape from silence did. But there's a trap here, too. Once people discover this, they can become unbearable. They learn that silence has leverage, and suddenly every meeting becomes a Western. Someone asks, "Could we move the deadline to Thursday?" And they sit there. 7 seconds. 8. 9. Maintaining eye contact as though tumbleweed is about to cross the conference room. That's not what I'm talking about. The objective isn't to perform silence. It's not a dominance trick, and it certainly isn't whoever speaks first loses. Real negotiations are more complicated than an Instagram quote. Sometimes you should speak. Sometimes clarification is useful. Sometimes silence creates confusion rather than information. Sometimes the relationship matters more than squeezing another concession from the room. And sometimes the person opposite you understands this dynamic perfectly well and is waiting for you. That's why the interesting question isn't, how many seconds should I stay silent? It's, what am I about to say, and why am I suddenly desperate to say it? Am I adding information they genuinely need, or relieving my discomfort? Am I responding to something that actually happened, or to a story I just constructed from somebody's face? Am I improving my position, or quietly dismantling it because nobody immediately reassured me? That tiny distinction is easy to miss, especially because over-explaining often feels productive while you're doing it. You think, I'm helping, I'm making this clearer, I'm keeping momentum. Meanwhile, your colleague is sitting beside you thinking, please stop helping. There may even be a point in your career where confidence stops looking like having the fastest answer in the room and starts looking like being able to leave a question unanswered for a few seconds without treating the silence as an emergency. Not because silence automatically gives you power, but because uncertainty contains information you haven't received yet. And if you rush to remove the uncertainty, you may remove your opportunity to receive it. So now, when I watch these moments, I'm less interested in who talks first. I watch for something smaller. Who changes their position before anything new has actually happened? That's the tell. A price changes, a boundary softens, a deadline moves, an argument acquires 6 unnecessary disclaimers, not because the other side produced new evidence, but because silence produced discomfort. Which brings me back to that $4.8 million. Maybe the dangerous 10 seconds weren't the 10 seconds after he named the number. Maybe they were the 10 seconds in which his brain decided, their silence means my position is failing. Because once he believed that, he didn't need the other side to negotiate him down. He could do it perfectly well by himself.